25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester has become one of the most infamous addresses in Britain. For 20 years, Fred and Rose West quenched their appetite for sex and murder inside this house of unimaginable horror. When police began investigating the disappearance of their daughter, it led them right to the West front door. Detectives were only just beginning to unearth the murderous history of Fred and Rose West.
It was on a scale that was really unprecedented.
Children are their things to play with. They are disposable. They're things there to be used and abused.
I've never for one moment doubted that Frederick West was a truly evil man. But he found in Rose the perfect sorcerer's apprentice.
This is the story of how Fred and Rose West became two of the world's most evil killers. Fred and Rose West are one of the most notorious couples in British history. For 2 decades, they sexually abused, tortured and murdered 9 women, including their own daughter, in their house of horrors. And between them were responsible for another 3 victims buried around Gloucestershire. When the news broke in February 1994, the media were only scratching the surface of the couple's terrifying life behind the closed door of 25 Cromwell Street.
5 days and nights into their excavation, and forensic teams have now unearthed 3 sets of human remains, all buried in separate places, 5 feet under the garden patio of this Gloucester home.
It's horrible to think that there are, dead bodies in a garden just down the road. It's just thoroughly disgusting. I mean, it's horrifying to think.
Totally shocking, especially around, in Gloucester. I mean, you wouldn't expect this to happen.
But Fred and Rose's horrifying story began many years before. In 1969, 28-year-old Fred West was married to his wife Rena with a young family of his own. But he had his eye on a 15-year-old girl named Rosemary Letts. Rose and her family had recently moved to the Gloucestershire area, whereas Fred was born and raised in the local village of Muchmarkle.
Well, Fred was the eldest boy in the family, and he was very much the target for quite a lot of abuse at the hands of his mother. So his mother sexually abused him, essentially, and he lost his virginity to her. And the family was a very self-contained one. Rose's childhood was similar to Fred's in many ways, in that it was completely dysfunctional and antisocial and abnormal. So she was abused by her father, who started raping her from a very young age. So what she took to be normal, what she took to be acceptable in terms of behaviour within a family really was anything but.
Fred pursued Rose. He was used to getting what he wanted. When the couple met, there was instant attraction.
Rose lived in the same village that Fred had a caravan. They met at the bus station in Cheltenham. She said that he could charm the birds off the trees, even though his appearance was shabby. He had not very clean teeth.
Well, these were 2 incredibly damaged people. They'd both come from abnormal families. And I think when they met, what they saw in each other was something familiar. So they both would have realised that the childhoods that they had were far from normal. But with one another, they felt that familiarity.
Maybe it was something that Rose gave off implicitly, but something in Fred connected with what had happened to Rose and the way she was and the way she'd been treated by her father. And it was like a union of 2 souls.
I think it was the perfect storm. The chances of these 2 people meeting was, it must have been a million to 1, but unfortunately they did.
By 1970, just a year after meeting, they were living together in Gloucester with Fred's stepdaughter Charmaine. His wife Rena was nowhere to be seen. Rose was pregnant with the couple's first daughter, Heather.
I think in the early days, perhaps the more dominant partner was Fred. He was older, he was more experienced, he'd seen more than Rose had. She'd come from this incredibly contained family. But I think as their relationship developed, she started to find her feet and find her confidence. And I don't think that Fred ever really trusted her.
For Rose and Fred, it was all about sex from the very, very beginning. Fred was the originator, but he found the perfect sorcerer's apprentice, the perfect partner, someone who shared his lust and someone who understood him and wanted to perform for him.
I think we have a lot of trouble making sense of Fred and Rose's relationship, and the reason for that is because we are people with emotions and normal feelings and ideas of what acceptable and unacceptable boundaries are around relationships. So I don't think I'd describe their relationship as a loving one.
Fred and Rose's traumatic childhoods had a lasting effect on the couple and their twisted approach to family life together.
It's always a very complicated question to answer how many children Fred and Rose actually had, because if you count Fred's daughter Charmaine along with Fred and Rose's 8, it's 9. But then you've got to add Rose's 3 mixed race children, all of whom were fathered not by Fred. All I would say is that all of them were deeply hurt, almost ruined by the parents.
I think Rose's early experiences within the family of being abused by her father wrote the script for what would later play out. So what she took to be normal, what she took as boundaries and rules really weren't going to work in the wider world. So what she was learning about in those early years would set her up to be somebody who didn't quite fit in.
And it was, to some extent, what Fred then adopted as a family habit. It was, if you like, a West tradition. I don't mean to say that that wasn't disgraceful, but it is nevertheless part of the family history and helps to explain something of West's behaviour.
2 decades later, it's 1992 and Gloucestershire police are searching for Heather West. In 1987, aged just 16, Fred and Rose's eldest child vanished from the family home. Fred had claimed Heather had run away, but she was never reported as missing. But after receiving allegations of child abuse at 25 Cromwell Street, detectives began to look into Heather's whereabouts. Chief Constable Tony Butler was in charge of Gloucestershire Police.
One of the children told a friend at school about what was happening to her. That friend talked to a patrolling police officer, in fact, about what her friend had told her, and it was a result of what the police officer then took that back, and it initiated a child protection process which led to the evidence being gathered.
5 of the West children were placed into care and the police began their investigations. They were interviewed about the darker side of their lives at 25 Cromwell Street.
What it brought to light was a family joke. The family joke was a simple one. You better watch out, because if you don't shut up and stop causing your dad or your mum any trouble, you'll end up like Heather, 2 down and 3 across in the patio. Fred had laid a patio behind Cromwell Street, was in squares, which was rather like a crossword. The family joke was that he'd buried Heather at 2 down and 3 across.
This issue, this Heather's under the patio, continued to be raised. And so we started to take this point seriously. We knew Heather had disappeared, had left the home, so we tried to trace her. And despite massive amount of inquiry to try and find out, she just literally disappeared off the face of the earth.
In February 1994, the police decided to find out if the family joke was more serious than the children realised. Armed with a warrant, they began to dig under the patio of 25 Cromwell Street.
When they arrived with the warrant, Fred and Rose were at the house and they went into the back garden and the officers started digging the garden.
Sensing the end was nigh, Fred asked to be interviewed by police.
Fred asked the officer if they could go down to the police station, and so they left. Fred said that he admitted that Heather's remains were in the garden, but the police were looking in the wrong place. And later that day, he returned with the officers and he indicated where he thought Heather was buried. The following day, officers digging in that area recovered a femur, and that was taken for examination by the forensic pathologist, who confirmed it was human remains. And that turned out to be one of Heather's remains.
Rose was being questioned at Cheltenham Police Station when the news reached her and her solicitor, Leo Goatley.
When Rose was told that Heather's remains had been found, she gasped loudly and was very distraught. How do you interpret that? Was that a mother's shock and distress, or was it a murderer's distress at being found out? At that time, I believed that she was shocked and distressed, and that she didn't know the extent of Fred's activities. And of course, at that stage, it wasn't about serial killing, it was about Heather. But of course, the thing unravelled pretty quickly with the excavation.
The police found more than they'd bargained for under the patio at 25 Cromwell Street.
When they found remains, they found not just 2 legs or 2 thigh bones, but 3. The interrogating detective said to West, well, unless Heather had 3 legs, there's another body. Oh, yes, Fred says, without drawing breath or hesitating. That must be the other girl, that'll be Shirley.
The police were about to unearth all the secrets that Fred and Rose West had been hiding at 25 Cromwell Street for over 2 decades. Secrets that would shock the entire nation. Fred told the investigating officers the other body was of his former lover, Shirley Robinson. Shirley hadn't been seen since 1978. When she disappeared, she was heavily pregnant with Fred's child. West also admitted that police would find a 3rd body in the garden, who he claimed was a friend of Shirley's. Throughout the questioning, he insisted on one thing, that his wife Rose knew nothing about any of the bodies.
I think when Fred was protesting Rose's innocence and taking the blame completely upon himself, I think, yes, at that point the power had changed in their relationship, from him being the dominant one in the early years to her really putting the strings in those later years. And I think he really didn't trust her at this point in time. He was really quite afraid of what she might do. So I think that was definitely something that had flipped in this relationship.
Well, I found him quite a creepy bloke. He would always be trying to endear himself to people in a rather smarmy way, a little kind of giggle, making light of things. But he was very unconvincing doing that. And he would very quickly realise if you weren't impressed by him. And then he would withdraw, and I would sense there was this other side to him that would scowl and be probably quite nasty. Whatever his sort of murky machinations within his mind were, once he realised, he was probably better able to actually charm women than blokes. It's possible that, you know, with a little smile and some sort of soft talk, he was able to persuade some young women that he was safe to be around.
To make things more complicated, Fred's story kept changing. He alternated between admitting and denying the killings and told detectives that all the deaths were accidental. He wanted to get charged with manslaughter and not murder. It would be a hard job for pathologists to prove otherwise.
It's very difficult when somebody's been buried for years to look at them in detail as a pathologist. You haven't got the skin, you haven't got the muscles, you haven't got the organs, the things that you'd see injury or disease in. So you really have to comment on what may not be there. It makes the pathologist's job a lot harder.
Finding the cause of death was difficult, and so was identifying the 3rd victim buried under the patio. There were approximately 10,000 missing women recorded at the time. By using dental records, experts identified the 3rd victim as Alison Chambers, who was just 16 when she went missing in 1979, meaning she cannot have been a friend of Shirley Robinson, as Fred suggested. Marks found on her body proved beyond doubt she'd been tortured.
Someone's behaviour is more in the realm of psychology than pathology, but quite clearly there's potentially the aspect of torture there, potentially of sexual violence, and when a pathologist sees findings like that, we're looking away from manslaughter and more into some sort of act of cruelty.
This proved that West hadn't accidentally killed these young women. He'd tortured, sexually assaulted, and intentionally murdered them. But was Fred doing this without Rose knowing? The police weren't convinced.
The most important thing, of course, was that these bodies were recovered in the house that she shared with Fred. And it would appear inconceivable that she wouldn't have had knowledge of this.
The house itself was very, very small. It would have been inconceivable that you could have kept a young woman or women in that house without every occupant knowing that something was going on. No matter how much tape you would have put over their mouths, no matter how much they'd been concealed in the cellar, you would know. It would have been impossible not to know.
The police began to look into missing persons files to try and find any more potential victims. But with about 10,000 missing women in the country, it was a seemingly endless search.
Throughout that time, we were trying to trace people from children's homes to make sure they were safe. We were dealing with forensic materials, massive amounts of forensic material, searching. It was on a scale that was really unprecedented.
2 of the missing people stood out. Lucy Partington, a 21-year-old student last seen at a bus stop in Gloucester in 1973, and Linda Goff, a 19-year-old who went missing in the same year. Her last known address, 25 Cromwell Street.
Fred and Rose adopted a sort of modus operandi. They would identify young women on the run, if you like, run away from home, run away from a children's home, run away from their parents. They were vulnerable. They would offer them a home. And time after time, Fred would pick up with Rose, often at bus stops, young women who looked a little lost.
So they would always choose people who would be in that position of vulnerability. And the fact that they were a couple, I think, was quite helpful to them in luring victims in, because the women that they targeted would be more likely to trust a couple. So when they would pick somebody up who was hitchhiking, that played to that idea of, well, there's a woman there, so I'm going to be safe.
Rose already knew the language of grooming. She was quite used to it. And when you hear the victims talk about how she spoke to them in this sort of quite soft, pleasing voice, you knew that, again, that was something she'd learnt.
Linda Goff was never officially reported as missing, but her family searched for her at the time of her disappearance.
Linda Goff's mother, she'd been round to the house, knocked on the door, and it had been answered by Rose West. And she asked where Linda was, and she was told she'd gone away, I think, to Weston-super-Mare. She was struck by the fact that there was Rose standing there with her Linda's slippers, wearing Linda's slippers, and she also noticed on the clothesline there were articles of Linda's clothing.
Linda's mother believed Rose when she said her daughter had moved on from Cromwell Street, but as the press coverage began to reflect the sheer enormity of the unfolding story, other women who'd encountered the Wests came forward. The police got a break when Caroline Roberts contacted them to offer her help in the investigation. She'd seen the investigation on the news and revealed to police she'd been sexually assaulted by both Fred and Rose in 1972. She'd known them for a while after they picked her up while she was hitchhiking, and even worked for them as a nanny for a short time. It was one horrifying incident that caused her to lodge a complaint against them.
They invited her back to the house, and when she got to the house, having been assaulted in the car by Fred and Rose, she got back to the house and she was then bound and subject to some rather aggressive sexual activity. She managed to escape subsequently and reported it to her mum, who then told the police. Both Fred and Rose were arrested for rape and serious sexual offences.
At the time, she was scared to face them at a trial and ashamed at what had happened. The Wests were charged with indecent exposure instead of rape. They were fined £100. But with the information Caroline gave to the police, they could link Rose to the crimes and bodies at Cromwell Street.
So we had that evidence that there was an aggressive sexual nature to her personality. The details of sexual activity that had taken place had a number of similarities, particularly talking about bindings and gags and so on, that were very similar, if not identical, to the material that was recovered in association with the victims when they were discovered.
This case was much more about the accounts of people and what the survivors were saying than what the pathology can tell you. There are things that they could say that the bodies were no longer able to speak to, and that was a bigger element of this case than maybe the physical findings by the pathologist.
On March the 4th, 1994, police moved their search inside the house. They had a feeling that down in the dark cellar, they may uncover even more bodies. On the same day, when news reached Fred West at Gloucester Police Station, he made a stunning admission in a handwritten note given to detectives. It read, "I, Frederick West, authorise my solicitor, Howard Ogden, to advise Superintendent Bennett that I wish to admit to a further approx 9 killings. Expressly, Charmaine, Rena, Linda Goff, and others to be identified. Signed, F. West."
Can you imagine the scene? It almost defies belief. They weren't sitting across the table from a monster, huge man with bare hands and able to kill a little insignificant chap, who nevertheless confesses to 9 murders. It's at that point the police realise, I think probably for the first time, that they are dealing with someone truly evil.
Fred was again taken back to the house and he indicated where some of the bodies had been buried, particularly the area of the cellar. And so what happened then was that we undertook a methodical search of the whole property. Fred maintained a position that Rose was not involved in these cases. You know, that's the inference, that he was trying to keep her out of it.
Fred took the rap for it. They had an agreement that she would stand by him and visit him, and he'd hoped to be out in so many years. But the minute Rose heard that he'd actually admitted to the murders, then she dropped him. He was gone. And she never spoke to him again. She absolutely refused to have any contact with him.
On March the 5th, 1994, the world's media had descended upon the home of Fred and Rose West in Gloucester. Police had exhumed 3 bodies from their back garden: their daughter Heather, Fred's pregnant lover Shirley Robinson, and missing teenager Alison Chambers. Now detectives were moving their search inside the property and began excavating the cellar at 25 Cromwell Street.
We started the excavations in the cellar. It was a difficult place to do excavations, and we had to be very careful about recovering the bodies. And on the first day, we did find 2 sets of human remains. One turned out to be Teresa Siegenthaler, and the second remains were Shirley Hubbard.
It was clear to pathologists that much had been done to try and hide the identity of all the murdered girls.
With Fred and Rose's victims, one of their hallmarks, as it were, was that the fingers and toes were removed. I think we can hypothesize that there may be different reasons for that. Simple cruelty would be one. But obviously, most people know that fingerprints are a very good way to identify somebody. So removing them, particularly in the 60s, 70s, 80s, before DNA technology was really recognized, would be a way to limit the chances of that person being identified.
And that was one of the big, one of our difficulties when we were doing the investigation, trying to identify the human remains, and in particular, Teresa's remains, because there was no evidence she'd been anywhere near Gloucestershire. But we were able to, in liaison with the Metropolitan Police and the missing persons, to come down to a sort of a short list of people that it could be. And then through using forensic techniques, we were able to be satisfied that we had identified her remains.
As the cellar excavation continued, officers escorted Fred to a field near his home at Muchmarkle. He told them if they dug there, they'd find the body of his first wife, Rena, not seen since 1971, a year after Fred and Rose had moved in together. Rena and Fred had been married for 9 years, but she was never reported missing.
So he was taken out to the fields, and he pointed out in one field, fairly close to a hedge line, where he said that he'd buried Rena Costello.
There were now 6 victims, and back in the cellar at Cromwell Street, even more bodies were being exhumed. Juanita Mott, a former lodger at the house, missing since 1975. And Carol Cooper, last seen walking home from the cinema in 1973. Plus 2 familiar names the police had been looking out for, Lucy Partington, and buried under the family bathroom, Linda Goff.
this was a tragedy for these young women. I mean, all murders are tragic for the victims and their families, but it was the scale of this, I think, that took the media's attention. I mean, it's almost incomprehensible that two people could abduct young women or lure them to their house and subsequently, you know, sexually abuse them and then kill them. I mean, it is on a scale that's almost incomprehensible.
By the 8th of March 1994, less than 2 weeks after beginning their search at Cromwell Street, police had found 10 victims. Most of them had been buried 2 decades ago when Fred and Rose were at their most prolific.
Aside from the sexual element to the murders, they were becoming, I'd say, maybe closer in a way, but I don't know whether closer is the best word to use to describe that. I think they were becoming more cut off from the rest of the world. This was something that only the two of them understood. It was something that we refer to as a folie à deux, a madness shared by two. So I think it was kind of cementing their relationship.
They were to him no more than sexual implements, a kind of doll, if you like. I know it's a horrifying thought, but they had no more humanity for him than that. He was a man capable of absolutely no conscience and absolutely no remorse. And everything he did was with Rose's help. And the thought of having some young woman hung up in the cellar, literally, by her hands, and a hook for Fred and Rose to abuse when they wanted to, over a period of days, almost defies belief. It is that horrifying.
9 bodies had been exhumed from Cromwell Street and one more, that of Rena West, Fred's first wife, in a field near Muchmarcle. But Fred wasn't finished. Although he didn't admit to killing her, he told police he had a feeling that Rena's friend, Anne McFall, might be buried in a neighbouring field. She's believed to be Fred's first victim, killed in 1967 when she was 6 months pregnant.
As he did with all his killings, he dismembered the bodies before he buried them. So he didn't bury them in a skeleton. He buried them in a tube, if you like, in which the body was compressed, the torso, head separated, arms and legs separated and shoved into a smaller hole. It made the search for those bodies a very complicated affair.
The problem with Anne McFall's body was that the whole land had been re-landscaped, and so there was this topsoil that had been put on there. Now, when you're looking for human remains, you can't just bring a big digger in and shove it all out. You are literally doing it by spadefuls and sieving every spadeful. And we actually excavated a hole the size of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. We were almost giving up hope that we were going to find the body, and we set a deadline for ourselves that if we didn't find them by date X, then we would stop. But fortunately, a couple of days before that deadline came in, we found some bones and then subsequently recovered the body.
During the 2 months of digging for Anne McFall's remains, the police had arrested and charged Rose West with murder. For each victim, she claimed, "I'm innocent." The police's evidence was circumstantial, and defence lawyers felt there wasn't enough to connect her to the murders.
Rose West said, "I had nothing to do with this." And the Crown are saying, well, we've got a statement from so-and-so who says that you were involved in an abduction and sexual abuse. Well, to a point you say, well, so what? What's that got to do with murder? Fred had said in his interviews, he fully admitted them and said Rose had nothing to do with them. So the first point is to say, well, what is the strength of the case against Rose? She's denying it. Where's the proof that she was involved?
While police continued their search at Cromwell Street, they also turned their attention to a second address, 25 Midland Road, Fred and Rose's first home together in Gloucester. Investigators believe that somewhere in the house or garden they might find the body of Charmaine West, Fred's stepdaughter from his marriage to Rena. An extensive search began.
At the time of Charmaine's death, she was living at 25 Midland Road, a house that subsequently Fred and Rose had left. But we went to the house and, again, excavating under the floor of the kitchen, we found Charmaine's body.
Charmaine hadn't been seen since she was 8 years old in 1971 and hadn't been reported as missing. In the same year, Fred was in jail for 9 months for motoring offences and stealing fence panels from his then employer. The police were convinced they'd finally got a breakthrough. They were confident Charmaine must have been murdered by Rose while Fred was serving time.
Rose was jealous of Charmaine. Charmaine was a very bright little girl, and I think Rose could see that she was getting the upper hand of her, and she didn't like it. The younger sister knew to keep quiet. It was best not to antagonise Rose, and Charmaine was quite a feisty little girl.
So there were slight differences in the modus operandi. You know, certainly with the others, you can imagine Fred going about his work with a sort of builder's precision and routine, you know, severing the limbs and the head, digging a hole in the ground and placing them in it. Charmaine was different. Nevertheless, Fred was charged with Charmaine, even though there were, from the outset, issues about whether Fred was present or whether he was in prison. So there was always that slightly nebulous issue about how old precisely Charmaine was and the dates when she died.
With the high-profile trials imminent, the police had to somehow prove that Rose West was just as guilty as her husband Fred. But before they got a chance, there was a major setback in their case. In December 1994, 10 months after police had begun to search 25 Cromwell Street for Heather West, the bodies of 12 young women had been unearthed across Gloucester. Fred West was thought to be responsible for all of the deaths, and police were desperately trying to find some evidence to prove that his wife Rose was implicit in 10 of the murders. Both had been arrested, charged and were awaiting trial, but on January the 1st, 1995, Fred West took his secrets to the grave.
Fred was in custody at Winson Green Prison in Birmingham, and on the 1st of January 1995, he was found dead in his cell. He died from hanging, and it was subsequently determined that he committed suicide.
Fred West was always a cunning man. He planned his suicide as carefully as he concealed his bodies. He groomed the prison officers into thinking that he was an absolutely safe, harmless little man who could do no wrong and was very happy to collaborate with anything they wanted. Indeed, he volunteered. He said, "I'll mend shirts. Don't worry, give me something to do. Be a pastime for me while I'm waiting for my trial." Painstakingly, over a period of weeks, he stitched together a rope, partly from bits of the blanket on his bed, partly from pieces of shirt, very carefully, because he had decided that he was not going to trial and that he was not ever going to confess the true extent of what his crimes amounted to.
There was a total loss of control by Fred over Rose. I've no doubt about that. She made it abundantly clear she wanted absolutely nothing else to do with him, and she blanked him in the dock. Independent of his relationship with Rose, he lacked empathy with people. People were objects to be used and abused. The fact of the matter was, he knew the game was up. He'd made the admissions, the remains had been found, the terrible story of those victims unfolded.
For those who knew the West family, this is just another macabre twist in a story that first came to light 10 months ago. In the words of one neighbour, if Frederick West really did kill himself, then it seems almost appropriate that a man accused of taking so many people's lives should end up taking his own.
Fred's suicide was a huge problem for the police. It put the entire case in jeopardy.
With the death of Fred, we were concerned that the press might feel, well, the case against Fred is now finished and therefore we can disclose information because the case is closed. That would have been a disaster for us because it would have then compromised the trial of Rose West.
The police were desperate. While Fred had confessed to 11 of the killings, Rose had always claimed her innocence. Without any solid evidence, there was a real chance that Rose West was going to get away with murder.
I think it's the Crown that need to review their case and decide where they want to take it from here.
I would hope that they will drop the case.
I thought it was possible the case might have been dropped. There were a lot of eminent observers suggesting that would be the case. The DPP had a different view, though, and in fact the case got worse against Rose. They added on the murder of Charmaine, which prior had been a sole charge in relation to Fred. I thought that was very curious. Rose thought the case was going to go away as well, but it didn't.
Prosecutors needed proof that Rose alone was responsible for the death of her stepdaughter Charmaine. They turned to forensic odontologist Professor David Whittaker.
The police brilliantly discovered, I don't know how, that a certain newspaper, national newspaper, had acquired a set of negatives, and they were large professional negatives, and they showed incredible detail in some of the baby teeth, the deciduous teeth of Charmaine, which I was then able to match exactly using our facial superimposition technology, and showed that they matched exactly in terms of tilt and position and grooving, and little rough edges were a perfect match. But the position of the teeth had moved, so if we could calculate that movement and assess it, of being able to determine within reasonable accuracy the time elapsed between the photograph being taken, which the police had a date for, it was written on the negatives, and the time of death. And if that fitted into the slot where Fred West was in jail, then clearly Mrs. West had a lot of questions to answer.
On the 3rd of October 1995, the world's press flocked to Winchester Crown Court to report on one of the most sensational trials of modern times.
Rose's trial attracted worldwide attention, as you would expect. It's very rare for a woman to go on trial, let alone for 10 murders. I attended it from the first day to the last. It was an extraordinary event.
As the trial began, Rose West pleaded not guilty to all 10 counts of murder, the 9 girls found buried at Cromwell Street and Charmaine. But the evidence against her was irrefutable.
So in court, in front of Rosemary West, I had all the technology available to reproduce the imaging of Charmaine. Dreadful thing to have to do in court, but the judge and the prosecution insisted. So Mrs. West actually saw this imaging developing in front of her. And I think it was about the only time she looked a little bit upset.
She marched into the witness box like a very angry traffic warden. Plain shoes, weighty woman, angry demeanour. This is all an outrage. It was all Fred. I had nothing to do with it. I knew nothing. It was completely inconceivable I could have done this. I couldn't have killed my own daughter. A tissue of lies.
We think of Rose West as this woman in the courtroom, in her 40s, great big glasses that she wore, quite a frumpy housewife looking. Those murders had happened a long time before then. She was actually very young when she committed the murders. She was, in fact, a teenage serial killer because she'd committed 3 murders before she was 20, and most of the murders were over by the time she was 26.
The evidence provided by Professor Whittaker convinced the jury that Rosemary West was guilty of all 10 murders.
He was able to say, and the jury accepted this, that he could pinpoint within a few days of when the child had been killed, and we had evidence that Fred was in jail during that time. So Fred could not have killed Charmaine at that time because he physically wasn't around, he was in jail.
I didn't think the trial had gone well for Rose, and the jury took quite a long time. It wasn't a 5-minute decision, it was many hours. They thought about everything very carefully. They came back and it was pretty well unanimous on everything. I mean, she was totally defeated.
When the first guilty verdicts came back, Rose did not flicker. Not a sign of emotion. She just simply stood there. There was no histrionics, no shouting, no screaming. There was no no sign of any emotion at all, really. And I was left with the overwhelming feeling that one had been in the presence of someone who had lost contact with humanity.
Sentencing her, the judge, Mr. Justice Mantell, recommended that Rose West should never be released. She was immediately returned to Holloway Prison.
Rose has never confessed to me. Whether she's made any kind of confession to anybody else, I don't know, but she certainly hasn't to me. I would say that tacitly, she, at various stages, gave the impression to me, with hindsight, that she knew that, you know, under the floor in Cromwell Street, there were a lot of secrets. That's slightly different to saying that she murdered people. But then the nature of the case, it was circumstantial.
300 miles from Gloucester, Rosemary West en route to the prison that will be home for a lifetime.
Today, Rose West is serving life imprisonment at Low Newton Prison in Durham. In 1996, a year after 25 Cromwell Street had given up its grisly secrets, it was demolished. In its place is now a public walkway, but nothing can erase the painful memories of Fred and Rose West and their house of horrors.
This certainly was a unique case in my experience, and I was involved as a detective investigating murders right back in the 1960s, and this is on a scale that's completely different. And I think in terms of its complexity, I think again it probably stands out as unique in criminal history. They were all young women who had their lives in front of them, and it was cut short for just brutal and selfish self-gratification of Fred and Rose.
I've never for one moment doubted that Frederick West was a truly evil man. I think he was born and bred. I think he only ever thought of himself. He was a psychopath and a sociopath. Had no concern for society, no concern for anybody but himself. But he found in Rose the perfect sorcerer's apprentice.
Many of us reflect on serial killer couples and say, well, if they had never met one another, would they have gone on to kill? We know that Fred had already committed one murder before he met Rose, so I think he would have killed again. When we look at Rose, I think she would have certainly gone on to harm other people, whether that was emotionally, financially, a non-physical kind of harm. But I think having Fred in her life opened up the door to a different kind of harm, a different kind of abuse.
I've never been in any doubt that Fred and Rose committed far more than 12 murders. I've always believed there are other victims, and they were buried in other places or concealed in other places. But to be fair to Gloucester Police, they can't dig up Gloucestershire in the effort to find more victims.
Speculation about other possible victims of Fred and Rose West will always remain. Theirs is a case whose shockwaves continue to reverberate around the world even today. The sheer depravity and the unimaginable terror of their victims is why we should remember them, not Fred and Rose and their house of horror. In February 2003, police were trying to track down a vicious attacker who was targeting young, blonde women.
He would run up behind them and hit them on the head, often with a hammer, repeatedly, and then run back to his car and disappear into the darkness.
One woman, Marcia MacDonald, had died from her injuries. And by August 2004, the assailant had claimed a second victim, Amélie de Lagrange.
He is a predator. He's stalking his prey, he's staking them out, and he's very organised and he's very planned, and that makes him incredibly dangerous.
The killer was a man named Levi Bellfield. Even after his incarceration in 2008, he was linked with the shocking murder of a 13-year-old schoolgirl.
I hate it when people refer to him as an animal, because animals don't behave like that. They kill to survive, not for fun and pleasure. He was born evil. He is pure, pure evil.
Levi Bellfield had cemented his place as one of the world's most evil killers. Levi Bellfield is one of the most notorious British killers in recent memory. He was responsible for the brutal murders of 2 young women and the attempted murder of another across an 18-month period between 2003 and 2004. While serving time in prison, he was again found guilty in 2011 of one of the highest-profile cases of the 21st century, the murder of schoolgirl Millie Dowler, a crime that had gone unsolved for almost a decade.
They've waited 9 years and been put through the trauma of this court case. They linked arms as the jury foreman pronounced Levi Bellfield guilty of murder.
But this killer's shocking story began over 40 years before. Levi Bellfield was born into a Romany gypsy family in Isleworth, West London on the 17th of May 1968. He was one of 5 children. Aged 10, Bellfield lost his father to leukemia, and as a result, he formed a very close bond with his mother.
Bellfield was very much a mother's boy, much beloved of his mother. It was a close-knit family, brought up in West London, in what was effectively once a huge community of travellers, and was groomed to thinking from the very early days that he was very special, that there was something particular about him. His mother encouraged him in that view.
I think during his childhood he was a bit of a tearaway. He was a young lad who wanted to do what he wanted to do and not much stood in his way. So he was often kind of larking around and getting into a bit of trouble at school, but nothing completely out of the ordinary.
By the time Bellfield was 13, he'd had his first brush with the law and was arrested for burglary in 1981. It would not be the last time he was in trouble with the police.
I believe Bellfield occupied what you might describe as the halo of Levi Bellfield. I am greater than anything. He was above the law, above suspicion, operated entirely under his own steam, in his own way, at his own time.
In 1989, 21-year-old Bellfield set up home with a girlfriend. They went on to have 4 children together.
He could literally charm the birds off the trees. This is a 19.5, 20-stone man with a huge neck, almost occupying his entire shoulders. He wasn't an attractive man, but my goodness me, he had the gift of the gab, and he didn't half use it to his advantage, particularly when it came to girls.
Another woman who fell under Bellfield's spell and would go on to have 2 children with him was his common-law wife, Jo Collings.
I first met him when I was about 17, 18, because we all used to go to a place in Twickenham called Cellars. But I kind of knew him a little bit before then, because where I used to keep my horses, he used to drink at the pub just round the corner, and his mum lived just down the road. Everyone knew him. He was always, everyone wanted to be around him. He was like the sort of the fun person to be with, always loud.
But Bellfield was not a man of morals and often had extramarital affairs. His job as a nightclub doorman helped him meet girls.
That way he had access to any number of young women, all of whom, how can put it politely, were not backward in coming forward. They were out for a good time, and Bellfield was out to help them have one.
He had the talk, the cuteness, and like I said, back in the day, he was good looking. Always had the nice car, always had nice clothes, and he could get the women.
But his charming persona soon disappeared once he'd got what he wanted.
In adulthood, Levi Bellfield became a man that women should be quite fearful of. He's somebody who was really entitled. He had a real sense that women were there to serve his needs, and when they didn't comply with his expectations, he would turn violent and very nasty.
The abuse started 5-6 months after we got together. Might not even have been that long, just with the odd slap and dig, and then he'd be really sorry, and it's because he said he'd never felt this way about anyone. I'd found out I was pregnant as well. So it was more He was trying to make out that, you know, he really cared and everything else. But, I mean, he was still seeing the one he was with before me at the time. Some of the abuse, he'd punch you, bite you, kick you, burn you with cigarettes, make you sleep naked on the floor, spit at you. You couldn't go to the toilet unless he was sat on the bath beside you. All sorts of things.
Despite Bellfield's violent behaviour towards the women in his life, they rarely reported him to the police for fear of what he might do to them.
Time after time in Bellfield's career, the women in his life could have pursued cases against him for violent attack, and yet persistently chose not to, and that pays some tribute to his extraordinary charisma.
I was the only one that had an injunction put on him, and within half an hour of him being served, it was torn up in an envelope through my front door, and he'd written on the envelope, "Now I'm going to kill you."
By 2002, Bellfield had fathered 11 children with 5 different women. He'd started a new job, clamping cars, and was living in the leafy Surrey town of Walton-on-Thames. On March the 21st, 2002, 13-year-old schoolgirl Amanda Dowler, known affectionately as Millie, went missing from her home. Journalist Martin Brunt remembers that day very well.
She was on her way home. She got off the train, was going to walk the half mile or so back to her home. She was in her school uniform, very identifiable. This was daylight, busy time of the afternoon, lots of people around, but nobody saw anything.
Millie had phoned her father to say she was heading home, but never arrived.
She seemed to have disappeared into thin air. There was CCTV footage of her getting off the train at Walton Station. Some very blurred images of cars and the odd person in the street where she was headed home, but nothing more than that. And it became clear very early on that police were really struggling to find what had happened to her.
The last sighting of Millie Dowler was on Station Avenue in Walton, just 50 yards from the home of Levi Bellfield.
The search has taken in stretches of water, including the River Mole, but police have been concentrating on ground near the busy station and interviewing commuters.
We have nothing that gives us any positive indication that she's gone off of her own volition. Equally, we have no positive information that she has been taken off the street and abducted. At this time, all of our lines of inquiry are open.
On September the 18th, 2002, 6 months after her disappearance, the body of Millie Dowler was found by a group of foragers amongst the trees of Yateley Heath Wood in Hampshire.
So Millie was identified through dental records. She was known to be missing. Dental records were obtained, and then they were compared to the remains that were present, and sadly for her family, it confirmed that that's who it was.
It was clear to forensic ecologist Professor Patricia Wiltshire that Millie's body had been in the woods ever since she disappeared.
I was able to tell the police how long each bone had been there and how long ago it had been moved, because the bones were moved around by animals, you see. There was no doubt in my mind, really, that she had been there since the early spring.
How Millie was killed remained a mystery.
The degree of change that the body goes through after death, particularly in the sort of timescales we're talking about with Millie Dowler, really hinders what the pathologist can see, what the pathologist can say. It doesn't mean that there's nothing we can see or say, but clearly the less we have to work with, the more difficult it is.
One likes to be objective, one likes not to think of the remains as a person, one likes to just look for the evidence and you try to be objective. And then, of course, they take you into a scenario where you become fairly emotional. Well, you can't help it. It's an emotional sort of scenario. And then it comes a bit of a shock, really.
The police had no suspects and no forensic evidence. And just 5 months after the discovery of Millie Dowler's body, only a few miles from Walton-on-Thames, another young woman was murdered. At around midnight on the 3rd of February 2003 in Kingston, London, 19-year-old Marcia MacDonald caught the bus home after a night out at the cinema with friends. It was the last time they would ever see her. Walking home, Marcia was attacked from behind less than 100 yards from her parents' front door. Colin Sutton was one of the lead detectives with the Metropolitan Police at the time.
Well, Marcia was found on the street where she lived, 10 or 15 doors down from her parents' house. Local resident heard a noise, heard a whimpering, if you like, and called police, and she was found there with this terrible head wound, and she was taken to hospital and died 2 or 3 days afterwards. Marcia was killed with a single blow to the back of the head with a heavy implement.
Forensic evidence suggested the weapon used was most likely a hammer.
Hammers are effective striking tools, so it's no great surprise that you can cause very severe damage to a human skull with relatively little effort with an effective hammer. You'll often see lacerations, they're often curved to match the profile of the hammer, and you'll often see skull fractures. They're quite often depressed, so pushed inwards towards the brain, because the hammer is exerting its force so focally.
Nightfall and detectives in Hampton still work on, but though they've searched tirelessly all day, they remain baffled as to who carried out this apparently random attack.
Often these things happen and are carried out by somebody the victim knows. In this case, I'm sure police looked at boyfriends, family members, but very quickly ruled out any kind of suspect like that. So it soon became obvious that this was a stranger murder, and those are very rare. So very soon, very quickly after Marcia's murder, people in the area became very concerned that there was a killer on the loose.
Subsequent investigations led police to a mentally unstable 16-year-old who wasn't competent enough to be charged or even interrogated about the incident.
And as a result, he was sectioned and was put into to some sort of institution compulsorily. And although he hadn't been charged with the offence, everybody kind of thought, well, it was him, and so we can put that offence to bed, and you know, we've solved that, if you like.
But then investigators noticed a possible link to similar attacks that had happened in the area in the months before.
There was another 16-year-old schoolgirl that she was thought at first to have slipped over in the snow and banged her head, and it was only then when Marcia was murdered that police looked at this occurrence some 2 months previously and realised that that could have been an assault as well. And they went back to this girl who'd been treated in hospital and were able to talk to the hospital staff and look at the description of her wounds and some photographs and conclude that the likelihood was that she too had been attacked but had survived. We found a couple of other offences as well. Again, young ladies had been attacked in the street and hit over the back of the head, and in both these cases they'd survived.
However, none of these other victims were able to identify the attacker.
They just, said I was walking along, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in hospital some hours or some days later. So we didn't have any kind of clue or sighting that led us towards the suspect for it, because they just simply couldn't remember it.
All of the attacks seemed to be totally unprovoked. Could they all have been committed by the same perpetrator, the man who murdered Marcia MacDonald?
As everybody knows, most murders are committed by someone you know, whether it's a husband, wife, lover, jilted lover. It's comparatively rare for random attackers to kill.
Then on the 28th of May 2004, 15 months after the murder of Marcia MacDonald, 18-year-old student Kate Sheedy was heading home after a night out in Twickenham, West London, to celebrate the end of her A-levels. Just after midnight, she caught the bus to nearby Isleworth and began to walk the few hundred yards to her front door.
She's walking along the road and she's aware up ahead of her was a people carrier that was sitting parked with the engine running. And she said it was white and it was sinister, was the phrase that she used. She said it looked a bit sinister because it had blacked out windows, and she just thought it was up to no good. She didn't like it. Some sort of sixth sense or whatever said to her, no, don't walk past that. So she crossed the road so that she would be walking on the other side of the road when she walked past the people carrier. She heard this people carrier start up, accelerate, and it literally came across the road and simply ran into her, just ran her over. She ended up on the road between the front wheels and the back wheels of the people carrier. It then reversed, so the front wheels went over her body again and drove off.
Incredibly, Kate survived the frenzied and brutal attack.
To overrun a human body with a large vehicle like a people carrier can cause very severe injuries. You've got all the weight of that vehicle going through the tyres onto the body. If that's across the limbs, you're going to get fractures. If it's across the head injuries. Obviously the chest and abdomen are very prone to injury from that pressure on it. And for somebody to be overrun twice and survive is very close to miraculous, and I suspect it's a compliment to the skill of the people who attempted to save her life.
She had terrible injuries. You know, she had every rib broken, she had her liver was in two, and various sort of injuries that she was so brave and she overcame, and she ended up going to university and you know, getting on with her life.
Although the attack on Kate Sheedy seemed very different to the murder of Marcia McDonnell and all the other reported incidents, detectives still believe they could all be linked.
It's similar in its outcome, and it's similar in the area where it took place, and the age and the victim and what she looks like and all this sort of thing. It's just the weapon. Substitute car for hammer, and it's the same. They ranged in age between sort of 16 and 32. They were all blonde or blondish, and I guess all of them were well dressed and were quite kind of sophisticated, looked quite well off, rather than perhaps some of the other people in the street.
Someone who fitted that description perfectly was 22-year-old French exchange student Amélie Delagrange. And just 3 months after the attack on Kate Sheedy, Amélie was found dead. On the 19th of August 2004, 22-year-old French exchange student Amélie Delagrange caught the bus home to her rented flat in Twickenham, but she missed her stop.
It was a nice night in August, and she thought, oh, it's not very far, I'll walk. And, you know, that was her fateful decision. Had she waited for the bus, she may well have been okay that night. At about 10:15, there's a young man walking around Twickenham Green, and there's a cricket pitch there, and he walked across the cricket pitch and found what he thought at first was just a bundle of rags or a bundle of clothes, but turned out to be Amélie, and she was lying there on the grass. Her shopping bag with her shopping in was next to her, and she had a single wound across the back of the head, was bleeding profusely. He thought she was still alive at that point, called for an ambulance. He ran to the shops on the north side of the green and alerted people to call police and ambulance, and she was taken to a hospital and died an hour or so later of this single wound, which had caused a catastrophic sort of fracture to her skull and a brain injury.
It appeared that Amélie had been killed by a blow to the head with a hammer, just like Marcia McDonnell. Police were now certain the killings were more than just a coincidence.
We were conscious that there had been a number of similar attacks in the area over the preceding sort of 18 months or so. One of those was the murder of Marcia McDonnell, and the other was the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy. And as our investigation progressed looking at the Amélie murder, so we realised that we had to look at these previous offences as well.
Like all the attacks reported, there appeared no motive for the murder.
Absolutely no reason for it. None. Simply a random killing. The most difficult kind of killer to catch, incidentally. because there's no connection. There was no connection between Emily de la Grange and Marshall McDonald. None. They didn't know each other, they weren't friends. There was no connection between those two and Kate Sheedy.
A second senseless murder in the same area meant the story was now front-page news.
Suddenly, we had potentially a serial killer on the loose, not on some scuzzy council estate, but in leafy Twickenham and Hampton. And that really struck fear in the neighbourhood, and police were struggling to find an answer for a motive.
The media were very keen to ask us, is this a series? Are we dealing with a serial killer? Because those words have a particular sort of connotation and mean something. And because we couldn't link them formally by DNA or fingerprints, we couldn't really say that. So what we said was that we had a linked investigative series. And what that meant was these offences are so similar in MO and in their location and the profile of the victim that it would be a nonsense to investigate them with different teams.
Pressure to catch the killer was mounting.
Truth was that, without being too sort of dramatic or too sort of cliched, we knew while we were investigating it that if we didn't succeed, he was going to do another one. You know, there was a time element in this one.
But there was very little evidence for Colin and his team to work with, particularly in Amelie's case.
Nobody had seen anything, there was no CCTV covering there. She had a boyfriend, she had no other kind of contacts really in you know, no family or friends or life history in England. She'd not been here very long, and it had all the kind of characteristics of a completely random attack, and they're often the very hardest to investigate, because not only do you not have the links to help you, but also they're quite often those murders that are pre-planned. And when people pre-plan murders, they tend to think about things like CCTV and their mobile phone data and all the other tricks and DNA and fingerprints and things, and all the things that we can use in most murder cases can be absent in pre-planned murders.
There was no DNA evidence at the scene of any of the attacks, but Amelie's mobile phone was missing. Police checked data to see when it was last located.
They were able, from the phone company, to get the information that her phone had switched off from the network, had been lost by the network, if you like, at Walton-on-Thames at a particular time. But this time was something like 8 or 9 minutes after she was found dying on Twickenham Green. And Walton-on-Thames is a considerable distance away, and it pointed to the bag with her phone in it having been taken away by somebody in a vehicle.
Detectives trawled through 2,000 hours of CCTV and eventually identified a white van at the scene, parked close to where Amelie was murdered. But there were over 25,000 similar vans registered in the UK, so the police weren't optimistic about finding the right one. But luck was on their side.
We had this file that was, the official name for it is the single suggestion file, I think, where people ring up and say, I've got an idea who might have committed that crime, it is, and give a name. And we had 129 people in this file, and every one of them had been suggested to us from a former wife or former girlfriend, or even a current wife or current girlfriend. And I termed it the women scorned file. So we thought, oh, we'll go and have a look through that and see if anybody in there had access to a white van, and we might be able to kind of shortcut the search that way.
The name Jo Collings surfaced. She'd come forward after the murders were reported and suggested her ex-partner Levi Bellfield as a possible suspect.
I was technically with him in a relationship 3-4 years, but he ruled my life for 11 years, every day. He would drive past my house 5, 6, 10 times a day, constantly ring me. He would walk down the alleyway at the back of my house and he'd ring me and tell me what time I'd put the kettle on, what I was wearing, who was around my house, everything.
Jo told detectives Bellfield had a white van for his wheel clamping business and that he had a violent nature with a particular hatred of blonde women. It was a pivotal moment in the case.
I'd always, at the back of my mind, because of how twisted and warped he is, you always think he could go that one step further. I mean, people say I'm as guilty as he is because I didn't come forward before, But there was never enough evidence or enough people willing to say, yes, actually, he did do this, he did do that, because so many people were scared of him.
We get the report we've had, which says, my ex-partner, Levi Bellfield, is a very violent man. He has got a hatred of women, particularly blondes. I found a magazine where he stabbed through all the photographs of blonde girls in it. He's very weird, and it's just the sort of thing he'd want to do. And he now works as a wheel clamper and uses a little white van to do it. So, oh, you know, that's exactly what we're looking for, somebody who's got a small white van. So let's try and progress that.
It was the ownership of that van that, in the end, led the police to Levi Bellfield's door.
By joining the dots, Colin and his team could link Bellfield to another vehicle, the car that ran Kate Sheedy down.
And one of the times that he was arrested was in May 2004, when he was arrested for kidnap, which was kidnapping the landlord of a pub near where he lived in West Drayton. And nothing happened about it, and the landlord in the end said, oh no, it was just a prank that went wrong, don't worry about it. Didn't want to press charges, no charges were brought. But the crucial thing was that that arrest took place, and that abduction took place indeed, in a vehicle, and that vehicle was a white Toyota Previa. Kate Sheedy had been attacked in Isleworth, not by being hit across the head, but by being run over by a large vehicle. And she said that this vehicle was something like a Ford Galaxy. Of course, that's exactly what a Toyota Previa is.
The White People Carrier, that was actually on my drive about 2 weeks before he ran Kate Sheedy over with it. Only because he asked me if he could leave it there for a couple of nights, and I begrudgingly said yes.
And he got somebody to go and do a check on the number plate of the Previa that Levi had been arrested in, and I remember her saying to me, Governor, I think we might have hit the jackpot, and said it was white. We now had somebody, Levi Bellfield, who had the right kind of white van that was used at the time Millie Dowler was murdered, and the right type of vehicle at the time that Kate Sheedy was run over.
Bellfield was now the prime suspect. At dawn on the 22nd of November 2004, police raided his West Drayton home.
In the attic is a naked Levi Bellfield. He'd covered himself up in the hope that no one would find him. Well, they did, and indeed the sergeant got him down and duly handcuffed him.
Of course, he said to us, oh, I was only hiding because I thought it was a gang, I thought it was somebody after me. Well, it was somebody after you, Levi, but it was the murder squad.
At 8:30 this morning, police raided several homes in West Drayton. The one behind me, that of 36-year-old Levi Bellfield and his common-law wife. The nightclub bouncer is currently being held at a West London police station.
Bellfield was interrogated by detectives in relation to a long string of offences ranging from rape to grievous bodily harm. He refused to answer any questions, and at one point he even petulantly turned his back on investigators. He was remanded in custody for almost 16 months until the 2nd of March 2006, when he was formally charged with the murder of Amélie de Lagrange and the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy. The murder of Marsha MacDonald was added to his list of charges on May the 25th, 2006. Bellfield's trial began at the Old Bailey on October the 12th, 2007. He pleaded not guilty on all counts.
Levi Bellfield's trial for the murders of Amélie and Marsha was very long, very drawn out. He was an imposing figure in the dock, big, tall, but it was his manner throughout it that I think drew most attention. He looked very bored. He did give evidence. There were glimpses of the charm, in a way, when he was talking. There was a point where he was explaining how you can be a successful wheel clamper. I'm not suggesting he charmed the jury, but I think some of them might have found him captivating while he was talking in those terms. But he also had a very squeaky voice that again was at odds with this rather physically imposing man in the dock. Denied any of the charges, and you got the impression that he felt that he would be acquitted at the end of it.
But the circumstantial evidence weighed heavily against Bellfield.
They found 20 or 30 sightings of this van, separate bits of CCTV, and that's when we built up the picture of this van circling Twickenham Green effectively. and driving around for a period of something like 45 minutes before Emily was murdered. Hunting, no other word for it. You know, it was cruising a very small area looking for people to approach.
On February the 25th, 2008, Bellfield was found guilty of the murders of Amélie de Lagrange and Marcia MacDonald, as well as the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy. Judge Mrs. Justice Rafferty sentenced Bellfield to a whole life tariff. He was immediately sent to Wood Hill Prison. He will never be released.
His modus operandi, according to the police, was that he got very angry if he approached a young woman that he was attracted to and felt rejected by them. And it is suggested that this is what happened in the case of the two women he killed.
So these women, they were disposable objects to him. They were part of his killing game, his sort of hobby, his leisure activity.
The day Bellfield received his sentence, he was named as the chief suspect in a case that had shocked the nation and remained unsolved for 9 years. The murder of Millie Dowler.
There was a lot of circumstantial evidence, particularly the fact that he had been living close by, within a couple of 100 yards of the place where she disappeared. It was established that he had use of and had used on that day his partner's red car, which matched one that was found in CCTV of the scene. But then there was the evidence of his partner, who said that Levi Bellfield had got up in the middle of the night of Millie's disappearance, and had made an excuse to go back to that flat. And when she later went to the flat, she discovered that the bedding had disappeared off their bed. And he said that the dog had fouled the bedspread and he'd had to burn it. Now, that was quite compelling evidence for the jury, and they were convinced that he was the killer.
On the 4th of March 2008, an ex-colleague of Bellfield, Kelly Fry, told ITV News he confessed to murdering Millie back in 2002.
He pointed out a flat in Walton and said that he used to live there and that he'd lost £900 in rent that he'd already paid because he had to move out. And he said, oh yeah, I also set fire to Emma's car. And I said, well, why would you set fire to your girlfriend's car? And he said, because I took the girl. That was his exact words. And immediately I just knew that he was on about Millie. If I, for 1 minute, thought that it was true, then I would have come forward a long, long time ago.
There was no forensic evidence, there was no smoking gun anywhere. They had to build a case with what people had been saying, with little facts, with phone evidence they had, with what CCTV they had, which wasn't particularly much. The whole thing came back to us knowing what Levi Bellfield had done on the night that Millie Dowler was abducted.
Bellfield had been questioned about Millie Dowler during the time he was on remand for his other crimes, and had always replied, no comment. But one person was certain he'd murdered Millie, his ex-partner, Joe Collings.
He said that he'd never been to Yateley and he had no knowledge of the area. Well, out of all the photographs, and I don't know why, everything I had I threw away. And I found an envelope and it had 2 photographs in it, and it was 2 of me and him at Yateley, which is really bizarre. And I'm a great believer of everything happens for a reason, and I wasn't meant to throw those pictures out because they were needed. And of course they showed him in Yateley, so he knew where Millie was found. He knew exactly the lay of the land because we used to go there all the time.
On the 10th of May 2011, Levi Bellfield, 3 years after his first trial, was once again in the dock at the Old Bailey, this time charged with the murder of Millie Dowler. Bellfield pleaded not guilty and refused to give evidence in his defence.
With Levi Bellfield, it's a power and control thing for him. because only he has knowledge of the murders that he's committed. Only he knows exactly who his victims were, the full extent of the women that he perpetrated these crimes against, and it gives him a sense of power. He's in prison now, so what he's got control over is very limited, but one thing that he still can exercise power over is that knowledge, and as long as that's his, then he's in control.
Geoffrey Wansell was in the courtroom during the trial.
What's striking about Bellfield is that he wanted to put every witness through a real ordeal because he never once pleaded guilty. He wanted them all to suffer, and he particularly wanted the Dowler family to suffer. It was as though he was smirking to himself, look what I'm putting you through. He sat there absolutely silent throughout this fierce cross-examination, utterly justified. I'm not criticising at all, in fact, it was perfectly justified. Bellfield made it happen. He made it happen by not pleading guilty, and he made it happen by instructing his own defence silk, his own barrister, to pursue the Dowlers to the full extent he was possible of. And it's very difficult to forgive Bellfield for that. And it underlines just what a malicious, malign, evil man he is.
On June the 23rd, 2011, the jury found Levi Bellfield guilty. Judge Mr. Justice Wilkie sentenced him to a further whole life tariff on top of the one he was already serving.
The fact that he is, as far as I know, the only convicted killer who's been given 2 whole life tariffs does make him unique. A judge in each case, the 2 judges, both felt that his crimes were so awful that he should be never given the chance of parole, that life will mean life for him. To be given 2 sentences like that is extraordinary. I suppose in practical terms it doesn't make any difference. Again, I suppose if he ever felt that he might try and challenge that, he's got to do it twice, and the chances of him ever being released are nil.
I think Levi Bellfield will be enjoying the notoriety that comes along with being a double life sentenced prisoner, because I think there is a certain hierarchy in prison in terms of the nature of the offences that you've committed, the type of sentence that you have, and he will very much see himself as the upper echelons of the prison population.
In 2016, it was reported that Bellfield had confessed to the murder of Millie Dowler, giving gruesome details of how he'd abused and killed her. But then, shortly after, he retracted the admission, causing the Dowler family untold grief.
He loves to manipulate, and he loved to manipulate the Dowler family, and they were his victims every bit as much as Millie was.
Well, basically what's going on when offenders like Levi Bellfield admit to things or don't admit to things or retract things is that they are eliciting quite a lot of attention. They are keeping people interested in them. They are playing with people, because people like Levi Bellfield, they are the puppet masters. They like pulling other people's strings. They like pushing their buttons and seeing what happens.
Levi Bellfield is now serving time at Franklin Prison. He has converted to Islam and calls himself Yusuf Rahim.
Nothing would ever surprise me with Levi Bellfield. I don't know what he's done. Only he knows what he's done. He would do anything if he thought there was an angle that made it the best thing for Levi Bellfield to do for Levi Bellfield. And he was ruthless, he was violent, he was sociopathic, I'm sure. So who knows what else he might have done.
He sees himself, and still sees himself to this day, as a powerful, charismatic, famous, now notorious figure whose place is guaranteed in the record books. It feeds his arrogance, it feeds his ego, and there's nothing that Bellfield likes more than feeding his ego.
In letters written by Bellfield from his cell to the makers of this programme, he claims that he has never confessed to any of his crimes and still maintains he is not guilty, saying, "I'm innocent of all my convictions. I've witnessed and done things I truly regret, but I'm no killer. My lifestyle led to my wrongful convictions. I blame no one but me. The real victims are the victims and families of these crimes. I am sincerely sad for their loss, but I am not a victim. My lifestyle put me here. My choice. My fault. But some of the people who know him better than others refuse to believe Bellfield's protestations.
Levi evil all blends into one. I've always said it before, I hate it when people refer to him as an animal, because animals don't behave like that. They kill to survive, not for fun and pleasure. He was born evil. He is pure, pure evil.
Bellfield is a psychopath. He deserves utterly to be in jail for the rest of his life. He's a preening, vain, manipulative, smart, deathly man. And if anyone deserves to be called evil, it's certainly Levi Bellfield.
Despite Levi Bellfield's claims of innocence, he has been convicted of 3 murders and 1 attempted murder. We may never know if there are other victims out there or not, but what we do know is that Bellfield bludgeoned 2 women to death with a hammer, ran another over repeatedly in his car, and killed a 13-year-old girl who had her whole life in front of her. Yet Bellfield has never offered any reason or remorse for his actions. He is, without doubt, one of the world's most evil killers. In March 2013, a man walking his dog on the outskirts of Peterborough in Cambridgeshire made a shocking and grisly discovery. Dumped in a rural ditch was the body of a man who'd been violently stabbed to death. The police didn't know it yet, but there was a serial killer on the loose.
When is the next body going to turn up? We've got to find out who did this, and we've got to find it quickly.
The investigation would lead detectives to a woman, a violent individual who'd killed without hesitation or remorse, and for no other reason than the pleasure and gratification it offered her.
She is heartless, ruthless, and sadistic.
During a 12-day killing spree, Joanna Dennehy butchered 3 men and left a trail of destruction that stretched from east to west across the UK.
She's not somebody who feels bad, who feels remorseful, who regrets things. She does what she wants to do, and she doesn't care about the consequences.
Joanna Dennehy had ruthlessly become one of the world's most evil killers. In April 2013, police in Hereford arrested a runaway fugitive and her besotted accomplice. In a killing spree that lasted almost 2 weeks, 31-year-old Joanna Dennehy had murdered 3 men and stabbed 2 others in broad daylight, leaving them for dead. One of the most dangerous women in criminal history, she's now locked away in prison and will remain there for the rest of her life.
The fact that she'll never see daylight again in the outside world is of huge comfort for the family. For Joanna Dennehy, it's absolutely the right thing that she won't come out of prison.
Joanna Dennehy's crimes were incomprehensible to the British public. At the time of her imprisonment, author and journalist Christopher Berry Dee took a special interest in the case.
I wanted to really try to get inside how the police were working and how rapidly they caught this very dangerous woman.
The strong curiosity he had for Dennehy's crimes caught the attention of the murderer herself, and very soon Christopher was in written correspondence with the killer behind bars.
Her letters, beautifully written, very eloquent, very good grammar, certainly on a par with somebody of a good education behind them. And we developed this relationship where I was trying to get inside her head, but at the same time, she, being the arch manipulator, was trying to get inside my head.
His attention peaked, and Christopher eventually went to visit Dennehy at Bronzefield Prison in 2015.
She looked into my eyes and she said to me, "Christopher, killing you would be good for me." And it was an ice-cold stare, I can tell you. So, yes, she would have killed me in a heartbeat if she'd had a chance.
The story of this cold-blooded killer begins over 35 years ago in the picturesque city of St Albans in Hertfordshire. Joanna Dennehy was born in 1982 and began life in a loving and secure family home. Very few could have predicted this bright and intelligent young girl would turn into a sadistic monster with a taste for violence.
By all accounts, she was starting off in life with what we might say is a perfect foundational upbringing.
Joanna Dennehy appears to come from quite a normal family. She had a relatively uneventful childhood. She's one of two siblings. Her mother worked in a supermarket. Her father worked as a security guard and for a telecommunications company. And from the outside, they appear to be a normal family.
She had a sister to which she was very close. They had even developed a secret language. She played netball for the school. She was a very normal, quite bright schoolgirl.
But Dennehy's idyllic childhood was curtailed as she entered her teens.
She started to experiment with drugs, she started not going to school, and she linked up with a man called John Dene.
Her parents, they were at their wits' end. They didn't know what to do. They tried to keep her locked up or bring her home from school. The teachers tried to reprimand her. And the more they tried to control Jo, it was Jo saying, "Stuff you." And it was literally like throwing petrol on a fire.
Dennehy and Dene ran away together, embarking on a turbulent relationship. Despite Dennehy's violent outbursts, the couple had 2 children together and eventually settled in Cambridgeshire.
I think quite a lot is made of the fact that Joanna Dennehy misused alcohol and drugs, but I think she's well aware of the fact that this is going to be discussed, and she knows that these offer quite a convenient excuse for her behaviour. And alcohol and drugs and other substances can disinhibit, but that's assuming that people have got those moral standards to begin with, and Joanna Dennehy didn't have them in the first place.
A very disturbed woman. She had done a lot of self-harm, of cutting herself and so on. So there were a number of danger signs that this was somebody who was not attuned to society.
As time went on, Dennehy's erratic behaviour intensified. She'd cheat on Dene and leave him and their 2 children for sporadic periods of time. Her drinking worsened, and she reportedly began to carry a knife hidden in her boot.
I think she's somebody who perhaps has always enjoyed hurting other people. It's almost like she's this crazy scientist and the world is her experiment.
Finally, in 2009, Dene took the children and fled from Dennehy, afraid of what she might do next.
The company that she was keeping as well, she was surrounded by people who were similarly disconnected. So I think when there was no check or filter or break on her behaviour, she was only going to get worse.
Dennehy had become no stranger to the local police. She'd been in and out of prison for drug offences and was also given a 12-month community order for being in control of a dangerous dog. In February 2012, Dennehy spent 3 days on the psychiatric unit at Peterborough City Hospital, where she was diagnosed with a series of disorders.
She has had various diagnoses attached to her: antisocial personality disorder, psychopathic personality disorder. And these are conditions, they're not mental illnesses. And there's a real important difference between the two, because people with personality disorders know the difference between right and wrong. They're fully rational, they're in control of what they're doing, but they choose to do it anyway. So she's not somebody who feels bad, who feels remorseful, who regrets things. She does what she wants to do, and she doesn't care about the consequences.
By 2013, 31-year-old Dennehy had settled in a small bedsit in Byfield, a housing estate in Peterborough. But the local residents were unaware of her troubled past or her violent nature. One of Dennehy's new neighbours was Michelle Bowles.
She was polite to me. But I wouldn't melt on her mouth, basically. She was well-spoken to me and never swore. She was actually quite pleasant, do you get what I mean? I showed her respect. She loved babies. She was excellent with children. I didn't have a problem with her. When I saw her or spoke to her, I said hello, she said hello back.
But other residents were not so sure. Michelle's friend John Chapman lived in the same building as Dennehy. He was a Falklands War veteran who'd fallen on hard times.
I don't know what regiment he used to be in. I should know, because the man of stories used to say, it's just John being smiley all the time and happy and like, nice to know.
But John Chapman didn't smile when Joanna Dennehy was around.
John was petrified. John came in mine and he said, on several occasions, there's this mad woman moved in. She says she's going to get rid of me, whatever way she can.
And he was right to be afraid. In just a few months, Joanna Dennehy's threats would turn to violence, and John Chapman would be dead. In early 2013, Joanna Dennehy was living in sheltered housing in Peterborough following the breakup of her relationship. Her ex-partner had left her after becoming increasingly concerned about her erratic and sadistic behaviour. The bedsit that Dennehy now called home was managed by Kevin Lee, a father of two who lived in Peterborough with his wife Christina. She remembers hearing about this strange new tenant. Christina has asked for her identity to be concealed.
He was stressed with work, the money element of it, it was turning into kind of a nightmare, really. It was getting a little bit unmanageable. Kevin used to house disadvantaged people. So he'd done it for years and obviously was used to giving people chances. And so he did with her.
But Kevin Lee and Dennehy's relationship quickly grew into more than just a business one. Lee began to employ Dennehy as a rent collector.
Obviously, I wasn't aware at the time. To me, it would have been just another tenant. And he just said about this woman and that she's really tough, really hard. He needed to evict some people, and whether she was threatening, and it suited him because he wasn't getting any joy from the council. So I think she had a bit of wellies and, you know, really big mouth and threatening, and I don't know whether that, at the time, he thought that was his only way out and to deal with these people.
48-year-old Kevin Lee became infatuated with the younger Dennehy, and they soon became lovers. In exchange, Dennehy was living rent-free in at least two of Lee's properties across Peterborough.
In a household, that becomes quite apparent if someone's behaviour's sort of changed and didn't seem quite himself.
Dennehy would make up unnerving stories to impress her new landlord and lover.
At one point, she told Kevin Lee her father had abused her and that she'd killed him. Absolute nonsense, of course. Never did anything of the kind. She was neither abused nor was he dead. But she was also a pathological liar.
Kevin just said about her that she spent 8 years in prison because he raped her as a child, abused her as a child. It's not unbelievable story, but then when Kevin said that she'd also killed other people and that she hadn't got caught for those, it sounded a bit far-fetched. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know whether it was a truth or whether it was just a load of old rubbish.
But it wasn't long before Joanna Dennehy turned her murderous fantasies into reality. 31-year-old Lucas Slabozewski had moved to the UK from Poland in 2005. After meeting Dennehy a few days previously, he began exchanging text messages with her. On the 19th of March 2013, Slabozewski went to visit Dennehy at one of the houses she was staying in on Rolleston Garth and was never seen alive again.
She almost certainly lured this man with the promise of some kind of sexual favour. But without a moment's hesitation, she stabbed him through the chest once, very, very hard, killing him almost instantly.
Slabozewski had been coaxed into Dennehy's deadly embrace. She led him to believe the pair were in a relationship. He willingly and naively entered the trap she'd laid for him.
Everybody that comes into contact with Joanna Dennehy, it's like falling into a spider's web, and you can't get out. Men can't get out. They become entranced by her for all sorts of reasons.
Dennehy had complete disregard for the life she'd just taken.
Dennehy puts this poor Polish man's body in a wheelie bin and then shows it to a 14-year-old. And so, look how clever I am. I've killed this man in the wheelie bin.
But it was only a temporary solution. Dennehy knew she couldn't keep Slabozevsky's body in a bin. She had to dispose of it quickly, but she needed help. She called upon one of her friends, 47-year-old Gary Stretch, who was more than willing to assist.
Joanna Dennehy is quite bright, she's quite clever, so she's able to exert quite a lot of control in her interactions with other people, and that's what makes her exceptionally dangerous. Now, looking at the relationship that Joanna Dennehy had with her accomplices, I think she was able to charm these men. She was able to kind of lure them in, really, and they would have been flattered by her attentions. You know, here she is, this younger woman wanting to spend time with them. These were men who had quite dull, quite boring lives, and I think they were quite excited to get involved in what Joanne wanted to do.
At 7 foot 2 inches tall, Gary Stretch towered above Dennehy's slight frame. An unsuccessful burglar, Stretch was absolutely infatuated by her twisted and lethal charms.
Gary Stretch and Joan Dene met when both of them were on parole from prison for various offences. She realised that she could use him to do whatever she wanted. He was her bodyguard, her minder. And that's how they formed this team, which became so overpowering for Stretch that he would do anything for her.
I don't think Joanna Dennehy had any emotional feelings towards her accomplices whatsoever. They were useful to her at the time, and she just cast them aside when she was finished with them.
With the help of Stretch, Dennehy dumped Lucas Slabozevsky's body in a ditch in rural Thorney Dyke, just 10 miles east of Peterborough city centre. Unable to control herself, her confidence rising and her desire for violence building, in just over a week, Dennehy would strike once more. She turned her attention towards her fellow Byfield resident, 56-year-old Falklands War veteran John Chapman, who reportedly had walked in on Dennehy while she was in the shared bathroom of their bedsit.
Every time he spoke about her, he was with fear, like this, in his tone of voice. And we thought, it's just John, just leave it. If she starts, here's our phone numbers, ring us and we'll come round, just, you know, help you and get you in here with us. He went, thanks. And that was the last time we saw John.
On March the 29th, 2013, Dennehy attacked the helpless John Chapman.
John Chapman was an inoffensive, kindly man who may have been asleep or in an alcoholic stupor when Dennehy killed him. But she did so by stabbing him once in the neck, severing his carotid artery, and then 5 times in the chest with such force that one wound broke the breastbone. It also punctured his heart. It's a frenzy that is quite difficult to comprehend, but evidence of what the behavioural scientists now call escalation. First victim, 1 stab wound. Second victim, 6 stab wounds.
It's heartbreaking. See a poor defenceless man killed. And to know what she'd done to him, how she killed him, it was just heartbreaking for us all.
Dennehy was developing her confidence and her crimes were becoming more and more brutal with each move.
Now, where Joanne Dennehy is so bad is that this woman actually used a knife to attack a grown, strong man is very up close and personal. It's not at a point of a gun, which is not quite such a personal thing. It's not by bludgeoning. It's not by strangulation. By nature, a woman is not often strong enough to strangle a strong man. But this is a young woman using a knife to repeatedly stab somebody, and for that reason alone, makes her a hands-on, bloodlusting killer. I can't describe how evil this woman is. I really can't. She's the worst I've ever met.
It's always been said the woman's method of killing is usually poisoning. It can sometimes be other things, but knives, no. It's a very male killing method. And it's led some people to speculate that Dennehy was to some extent trying to be more male, more masculine than the men around her, because she felt they were rather weak and feeble and she had to be the boss, and being a boss meant you were male.
But Dennehy was offsetting one role with another, that of a femme fatale, charming and enticing men into her life before switching character in an instant with deadly results.
We're quite quick to point to Joanna Dennehy's masculine traits because they're the ones that are most visible to us. Her aggression and her violence and the very brutal way in which she perpetrated these murders. But I don't think she's somebody who would be like that all the time, because that wouldn't serve her needs all of the time. I think sometimes she was feminine and she was demure. In a way, she's somebody who will just adapt her behaviour. So it's very difficult to know who the real Joanna Dennehy is.
After killing John Chapman, Dennehy didn't hesitate in continuing her rampage. On the very same day, she'd strike again with fatal consequences.
Later that day, she lures her boss and her lover and the bed-sitting house's owner, Kevin Lee, to the house.
But this time, Dennehy wasn't in the mood for love. She was searching for another victim to try and quench her murderous desires. March the 29th would be the last time that Kevin Lee was seen alive. Joanna Dennehy was in the middle of a murderous rampage. Having taken the life of 31-year-old Polish man Lukasz Slabozewski 10 days earlier, Dennehy had just killed 56-year-old John Chapman and had a third victim in her sights, her landlord, Kevin Lee. The pair had been having a secret affair. Kevin's wife, Christina, was the first to notice something was awry when he didn't arrive home on that March evening.
He was very much like a come home from work, tea on the table, pyjamas on. He was quite sort of traditional and old-fashioned in that sense. I tried to ring him and his phone wasn't on, which was odd in itself. He'd never have his phone switched off because that was his livelihood, that was his business. And I knew it had charge.
Kevin had felt threatened by Dennehy days before, but he'd wrongly assumed it was just bravado.
Kevin did tell me that she'd told him that she wanted to kill again, and I think that was the crucial thing, because it wasn't just a case of bragging or mentioning that she'd committed murders in the past. It was the fact that she specifically told him she wanted to kill again. So that's going to unnerve anybody, false or not. It's just not a thing that normal people say.
Hours passed. Growing desperately concerned, Christina, with the help of Kevin's business partner, Paul Creed, tried to trace Kevin.
I asked Paul to look at Kevin's phone records, so he gave them to me, and there was a number that kept appearing on the telephone, and I said to Paul, which houses are empty at the moment because they need work doing to them. And he gave me a list, and I subsequently just went round to each of those properties. I knew he was in trouble, put it that way, at that point. I knew there was something not right. I knew Kevin wasn't coming home.
Christina began an urgent hunt, unaware her search was in vain. Dennehy had already struck. She'd stabbed Kevin Lee to death at the same house in Rolleston Garth where she'd murdered Lukasz Slabozewski 10 days earlier. Lee was Dennehy's third victim.
I wouldn't describe Joanna Dennehy as a serial killer. I would describe her as a spree killer, because there didn't seem to be any points during her killing spree in which she returned to any semblance of what was a normal life for her. It tended to be a continuous chain of events.
What is not in doubt is that these first three victims were simply a prelude to what she hoped would be a further spree.
Dennehy, again with the help of Gary Stretch and this time another accomplice, Leslie Layton, deposited the bodies of John Chapman and Kevin Lee on the outskirts of town. Chapman was placed at Thorney Dyke, the same spot where they dumped Lukasz Slabozewski's body 10 days previously. Kevin Lee was left 10 miles further north at nearby Newborough. Dennehy dressed Lee's body in women's clothing and left him positioned in a grotesque and crude manner with his buttocks exposed.
I think Joanna Dennehy was unusual in that she liked humiliating her victims. It was clearly a modus operandi there, and there was clearly a motive, the pleasure of killing somebody rather than doing it for some particular reason.
Oblivious to the fate of her husband, Christina Lee was becoming increasingly concerned about Kevin's whereabouts.
I rang the police, then I went back with Paul Creed to one specific house because I noticed that the light wasn't on, and then it was on when we went back later. So I thought there's obviously somebody at the house, and I just said to the police, you know, I'm really worried, expressed my concerns and gave them permission to break into the house, which they did.
Inside the house on Rolleston Garth, there were no obvious signs of trouble, but the police immediately sensed that something was wrong.
They said that they could smell, there was a really strong smell of bleach, and they could see some blood on the floor, and, you know, I just knew.
And Christina wouldn't have to wait long for news of her husband. The following day, March the 30th, 2013, police were called to an area of farmland in Newborough by a dog walker who'd made an horrific discovery.
You know, you see it on TV all the time, the dreaded knock at the door. And then 2 detectives came. And obviously he had not been identified at that point, but they just said that they'd found a body, which, you know, I was expecting to hear that. So they just kind of told me what I was expecting to hear. You don't feel anything because you know. And it's a feeling that you've never felt. So, you know, where some people might think you'll be doing this, you'll be doing that. I don't know, it's just kind of a blur, really. You're just alive. I think that's, but not alive, you're just existing.
For police, a very serious picture was beginning to emerge of a killer on the run with an unstoppable determination for destruction.
When is the next body going to turn up? We've got to find out who did this, and we've got to find them quickly.
Detectives soon discovered Kevin Lee's burnt-out car. Christina had provided them with Dennehy's phone number, and by using it, they were able to form a crucial link.
They must have been trying to call it too, and using their systems or whatever, must have tracked it down through GPS that the location of Kevin's burnt-out car was where this mobile had been. So it was quite obvious that she'd been there.
They realised that he knows somebody called Joanna Dennehy, and there was an affair between them. And then they came across a man called Leslie Layton, who they interviewed. He tried to cover up, he didn't know anything about them, where they were, which in fact he did. He soon cracked because he was weak-willed, spineless, and he said, yes, Dennehy and Stretch are on the run, they've gone east, and they'll probably come west. And with that, the police went wallop. They issued a national wanted alert for every agency in the country to find this couple as quickly as possible.
Dennehy and Stretch were now wanted fugitives. She revelled in the idea, high on the thrill of being on the run.
She loved the notoriety of it. She relished the fact that the men around her were frightened of her.
In an attempt to try and evade the authorities, Dennehy and Stretch first headed to Norfolk, where they burgled a house. They then made their way across country to Hereford with the intention of selling the stolen goods to help fund their escape.
Dennehy and Stretch became a sort of I hate to say this, a Bonnie and Clyde type outfit. Their faces were in all the newspapers now. They were wanted, most wanted.
After they burgled another property in Hertfordshire, the pair stopped 20 miles outside of Hereford to liaise with a man named Mark Lloyd, who joined Dennehy and Stretch on the journey.
They get an accomplice or a friend of theirs to bring the stolen property into Hereford town to sell it, and it's at that point that Dennehy decides she wants to kill again.
It had been 4 days since the murders of John Chapman and Kevin Lee. On April the 2nd, 2013, with Mark Lloyd in tow, Dennehy was caught on CCTV entering this small shop in Hereford at 3:30 p.m. She's seen pointing at the cashier in a threatening manner. Just 10 minutes after this footage was captured, Dennehy, in an unprovoked random attack, attempted to murder a fourth man.
She had this terrific anger and bloodlust. She's had a quarter bottle of whiskey. She's been smoking roll-ups, and she suddenly sees a man walking his dog in broad daylight, and she says to Stretch, "Stop, we stop the car, I want to kill him."
Brandishing a knife, Dennehy jumps out of the car and runs up behind him and stabs him in the back.
Dennehy's unfortunate victim was Robin Baressa, a 63-year-old retired fireman.
You knew exactly what she intended to do. "I'm going to kill you," she said to the fireman. "I want to hurt you, I'm going to kill you."
And she plunges this 5-inch lock knife into his back, time and time and time again. The man thought he'd been punched. He turned around and saw her covered in his blood. He collapsed. She calmly walked away and got in the car and said to Stretch, "No, let's go and find somebody else."
Back in the car, Dennehy took the time to pose for this selfie. It seemed unbelievable to imagine, but she wasn't finished. Having felt the thrill of attack once, she hunted out her second victim of the day.
10 minutes after the first attack, she spots another man walking his dog, and it was the same bloodthirsty scenario all over again. She got out and she told Stretch to stop the car. She got out with this very small knife, walked up to him and plunged it into him time and time and time and time again. Can you imagine the shock? This man wouldn't have known what was happening. It's broad daylight. She's licking the blood off of the knife, his blood. He feels himself getting dizzy and sick. And then he collapses. And she takes this dog, walks casually back to the car. Another car passes and she waves at the people in it. They get in the car and off they go.
This second helpless victim was John Rogers, a 56-year-old Hereford local. Dennehy stabbed him more than 30 times. It was an horrific and entirely spontaneous act, completely lacking in reason.
It is a reflection of a brutality, a viciousness, a lack of any kind of control that makes Dennehy very unusual. She is a most frightening figure who behaves in the most obscenely violent way imaginable, almost defying belief.
When we look at the two attempted murders, towards the end of her spree, this is something altogether different. These are strangers, these are men that she doesn't know. So I think what was happening here was that she was upping the ante, she was getting bored. You find that psychopaths tend to have a proneness to boredom and a need for stimulation, so she was even applying that to her murders.
Remarkably, both men survived these attacks. Although their injuries were life-threatening, they were still able to give the police descriptions of Dennehy and the instantly recognisable star tattoo on her cheek.
By now, the police sirens are going all round and blue lights are going all round Herefordshire. They're panicking. It's like somebody's kicked over a wasp nest.
The local police had been alerted to her spree and were about to put an end to her bloodshed. They cornered Dennehy and Stretch on Newton Close in Hereford.
2 officers turn up and they spot this car with Dennehy in it, talking to the dog on the back seat, while Gary Stretch is trying to negotiate stolen property at the front door of one of his associates' house. They arrest Dennehy on the spot. Gary Stretch and one of his friends do what they call in police parlance a runner. They jump in another car and speed off. Something like a car chase goes on for about 20 miles. And then Stretch decides to get out and run for it. Now, Mr. Stretch is not built for speed. And of course, he's very unfit and he's stopped. And he turned around to the police officer and said, "You've arrested me. Joe and I would have been the next Bonnie and Clyde."
Footage of Dennehy in custody at Hereford Police Station just 40 minutes after stabbing 2 men and leaving them for dead showed her laughing and joking with the arresting officers.
One mark for attempted murder and murder. Attempted murder and murder, is that it? So going down for Sunday Rose? Excuse me.
Joanna Dennehy is like a chameleon. She's become a very accomplished actor, so she will play to whatever audience is in front of her. She can be charming and sound very educated and literate. And at the same time, to another audience, she could sound quite rough and quite downbeat. So she's really honed these skills of responding to the people that are around her.
The following day, April 3rd, 2013, the bodies of Dennehy's other 2 victims were discovered just outside of Peterborough. In a ditch on farmland at Thorney Dyke, investigators found 31-year-old Lucas Slabozewski and 56-year-old John Chapman, a close friend of Michelle Bowles.
We wasn't concerned till we actually noticed he was missing. No one had seen him at all. And next thing we knew, the forensics were around the back of the house. We were praying outside, thinking, please don't let it be John, let him live. If we had known what he meant and what she was going to do at the time, we would have got John out of that house and let him live with us. But how were we supposed to know she was a serial killer? To take John's life, Lucas's life and Kevin's life. Why?
Joanna Dennehy's pre-trial hearing was set for the 18th of November.
It's very difficult to understand quite how far the road is from a nice suburban upbringing to a ditch in Peterborough where you're dumping the bodies of men you've stabbed to death. It's an extraordinarily long road, a very dangerous one and a very destructive one, but she certainly travelled it and took some pleasure in the travelling.
At the hearing at the Old Bailey, Dennehy was devoid of remorse. She laughed as proceedings took place and stunned her legal team when she chose to plead guilty.
The fact that Joanna Dennehy decided to admit murdering these 3 men and denying them a lawful burial took the whole of Court 2 by surprise, including her defence barrister, who said that proceedings weren't going as anticipated. So the judge asked Joanna Dennehy in the dock what she'd said. She told him, "I have pleaded guilty, and that's that."
Karim Khalil, defending Gary Stretch, remembers the shock that rippled through the courtroom when this unexpected plea was heard.
It surprised all, I think, but the judge, who seemed entirely satisfied with that result. Her counsel asked for time to speak with her to see whether she really had meant what she just said, and returned to tell the court that, yes, she entirely understood the charges against her. She meant to plead guilty, and that was the end of it.
Many of the serial killers I've interviewed, obviously as guilty as sin, try to hide behind the criminal justice system and use it as a defence, to retreat back into it, to use mitigation. I didn't intend to kill somebody, but I had a drink disorder or a drug disorder. I'm not culpable of committing these crimes, basically, I'm innocent. Joanna Dennehy is not like that. She just loved it.
Kevin Lee's widow, Christina, couldn't bring herself to face the woman who dragged her husband down into her own sordid world and destroyed her family.
I went to court, but I stayed in the family room. I didn't want to be in there because I didn't want that thing to ever see my face. I thought, you haven't got the luxury to grace my face, so therefore you shall not see me. She was that cocky and pathetic, and it's so predictable. And I just thought it's just so abhorrent that I thought, no, it's just best off in another room.
During the hearing, Dennehy's partner in crime, Gary Stretch, argued he was manipulated by her throughout the killing spree.
Gary Stretch's position was that he had not known that she was going to kill any of the people that she killed, whilst accepting that after the event, he was made aware that she had killed people. And the difficulty, of course, that he confronted was the assertion that he was a willing participant in covering up those killings once he became aware of them. There's no question in my mind that Dennehy did influence Gary Stretch hugely.
Joanna Dennehy is somebody who was very much in the driving seat all the way through the murders that she committed, and the men were just there in a supporting role. You know, she was the centre stage actor here, and I think the fact that she was doing this on her own. She wasn't coerced or compelled by anybody else. It does make her quite unique.
In a final act of defiance, Dennehy refused to relinquish control of her fate over to the legal system. She stood up in court and told the judge exactly how she felt.
I don't want to be controlled by anybody. I don't want to be controlled by my lawyers, by the police, by anybody. And that's what she told the judge. Get stuffed, basically. Get stuffed, Your Honour.
On February the 28th, 2014, Mr. Justice Spencer sentenced Joanna Dennehy to a whole life term. She became the first woman in British history to directly receive this highest of custodial sentences in a courtroom. Dennehy was immediately sent to Bronzefield Prison. She will never be released. Dennehy's accomplices were also imprisoned for their part in her crimes. Leslie Layton, who helped dispose of 2 of the bodies, received 14 years, and Gary Stretch received 2 life sentences. It was a bittersweet relief for Michelle Bowles.
It's the victim's family as well that are carrying the life sentences, isn't they? Carefully's not going to see his kids have kids. Lucas is never ever going to have kids. John, you know, he's never going to be around again. None of them are. He wasn't a horrible person. He was one of the loveliest, genuine people you could ever meet. He really was. He would have done anything for anybody.
It'll take years for Christina Lee and her family to get back to normal after Dennehy callously ended the life of her husband.
Personally, it makes you want to rethink the death penalty. To me, that'd be too easy for somebody like that. Let them rot wherever they are, really. So, yeah, I expected that. I think it was just so hideous how a female, you know, it's hard to even think that's a woman. Would I say she got what she deserved? Not at all. She didn't get what she deserved. She just is where she needs to be. It's just everything has changed. You know, what was a family unit and people just going about their business, everything came crashing down. He was a laugh a second. He was one of the most optimistic persons I've ever come across. Never moaned about anything, not negative about anything. Any problem would be overcome. We laughed a lot. So, yeah, we had a lot of fun.
Joanna Dennehy has refused to disappear quietly. Even in prison, she's continued to wreak havoc.
From the day Joanna Dennehy was sentenced to prison, she has exhibited more antisocial behavioural traits, in as much as she's tried to escape twice. She wanted to chop the fingers off a prison officer and use that on the electronic keypads to get out.
Dennehy's absolute lack of remorse and the savagery involved in her crimes are beyond the public's understanding of what a woman would usually be capable of.
Joanna Dennehy was unusual in that the most notorious women murderers in this country have tended to be associated with a man, either Myra Hindley associated with Ian Brady or Rose West associated with her husband Fred. Dennehy was kind of acting alone, although she had people helping her a bit afterwards, covering things up, but she was a kind of self-motivated murderer.
I think the reason that we're so fascinated and so shocked by female serial killers is because of our general expectations of the role of women in society. We expect them to be the carers and the nurturers and the givers rather than the takers of life.
Dennehy touched the public imagination because she was a young woman and one who seemed to contradict everything that most of us expect of women. And to do so in such a cavalier and violent way that she set herself apart from the female population.
She's in prison now, and she's going to be in prison for the rest of her life. But Joanna Dennehy will not stop manipulating. She will manipulate the system. She'll work the system. And when the time's right, she'll definitely kill again.
It's difficult to comprehend the insatiable killing spree of Joanna Dennehy. With a lust for blood and a twisted lack of morals, she manipulated others along her way as she murdered 3 men and brutally attempted to kill 2 strangers in broad daylight. The safest place for a dangerous individual like Joanna Dennehy is behind bars, which is where she will remain for the rest of her life.